So I will go ahead and introduce our amazing as the expert for tonight. Her name is Kelsey Baker. She's a youth ambassador for the Tourette Association of America. So she's going to do a presentation. So at the end, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and she will get to those questions, or I will get to those questions. If you have a question about NAMI Miami-Dade or programs, anything that you want to ask, let's wait towards the end of the presentation and we'll get to those questions. Also, if you at the end want to unmute yourself, and if you have any comment or any question, you can do that as well. But I will ask you to mute yourself while our expert, Kelsey Baker, is doing her presentation so we can all learn from her and go through the presentation and wait till the end for questions. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being a part of this amazing community. And with that, I'm going to let Kelsey take it away and start her presentation. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kelsey. A little bit about me. I am 18 years old. I'm from Miami, Florida. I really love figure skating, makeup, and going to school. I will be attending FAU and I will be studying neuroscience. So I really want to go into this field and actually study Tourette syndrome. And I am the youth ambassador for the state of Florida for the Tourette Association of America. I've been the youth ambassador for about 2, almost 3 years now. They flew me out to Washington, D.C., where I got trained on how to present these. And then I got to speak to the lawmakers for the state of Florida on increasing funding so the association can continue doing research on Tourette syndrome. And I've done probably around 15 of these presentations. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what Tourette syndrome is, tics, what it feels like to have Tourette's, Tourette syndrome in the media, and then we'll have time for questions and answers, and then I have a couple resources. So Tourette syndrome is a tic disorder and a movement disorder. It is a neurodevelopmental disability, neuro meaning it occurs in the brain, and developmental meaning it grows and changes with the person as their nervous system and their brain grows and changes. So everyone's brains and bodies have chemicals and neurotransmitters that are being shot from the brain to different parts of your body. So a normal person's brain would shoot messengers from their brain to their arm, telling them to raise their hand. And then when those messengers stop shooting, the arm goes down. But with people with Tourette syndrome, the messengers just keep on firing and our hand can remain up for extended periods of time. It's also important to mention that Tourette syndrome is a disorder of disinhibition. So that means it doesn't like to listen to anyone or anything. So if there was a wall of wet paint right next to me, my tics more than likely would take my hand and drag it through that wall of wet paint, even if there was a sign saying, please do not touch wet paint. So anyone can have Tourette syndrome. It affects all races, ethnicities, genders, ages. No one is more likely to get Tourette syndrome than anyone else, and it is a lifelong condition. So it used to be 1 in 100, but now due to new research and surveys, now it's 1 in every 50 children between the ages of 5 and 14 have Tourette syndrome or another persistent tic disorder. So it is important to mention that Tourette syndrome is not the only tic disorder, and there is classifications that you must meet in order to be diagnosed. So there are different tic disorders such as chronic or provisional tic disorders, PANS, PANDAS, and FND, which is functional neurological disorder. So throughout the country, 1 in every 160 children between the ages of 5 and 17 are diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. And there is an estimation that 50% of people who actually have TS go underdiagnosed. So Tourette syndrome is a tic disorder. So obviously the symptoms are tics. So tics are involuntary, rapid, and sudden repetitive movements or sounds. And Tourette syndrome cannot be cured, but there are treatments that can help manage the symptoms, such as medication or therapies, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. So tics are not the bug, it's TIC. So they are, as I mentioned before, uncontrollable movements or sounds, and some people like to describe it as sort of a sneeze. I like to describe it as a really persistent cough. If you've ever had one of those massive cough attacks, where you have that cough in your chest and you just want to like let out 30 of them, but you try to hold them in because you don't want everyone to hear you coughing 30 times. But the more you hold it in, the worse it gets. That's what it's like to have a tic. So there are different types of tics. There are motor tics, which are the movements, and vocal tics, which are the words, sounds, phrases. So in order to be diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, you have to have at least 2 motor tics and 1 vocal tic for about a year. Most doctors like to wait about a year and a half just to really make sure as they run other testing. And within those families, you have a bunch of different things that could happen. Everyone with Tourette syndrome is different, so not everyone experiences the same tics as others. But some of the most common motor tics, we have simple ones and then complex ones. The simple ones involve just one muscle group, and then a complex one would involve combinations of different muscle groups and movements. So some simple ones can be eye blinking, facial grimacing, jaw movements, head bopping, jerking, shoulder shrugging, neck stretching, or arm jerking. I have a lot of those, and it is not fun. And then you also have complex motor tics, which is hopping, twirling, jumping, sticking out the tongue, kissing, pinching, or tearing paper and books. I had a tic for a really long time where in class, my tics would get me up out of my seat in the middle of lecture, and then I would jump and twirl at the same time in the air and sit back down like nothing ever happened. So then we also have vocal tics. These can go from very, very simple sounds to extremely complex words, phrases. So simple tics would be sniffling, throat clearing, grunting, hooting, and shouting. Complex could be words, phrases, anything out of context. I had a tic for a very long time where I would repeat the entire court scene from Legally Blonde, that entire like 3-minute, 4-minute iconic court scene where Elle is questioning the witness. That entire thing became a tic. And I couldn't stop it in the middle of it. So in the middle of any conversation, it would just come up and then I'd have to finish with that. So there are different tic families, as we like to call them, and they're all part of the complex tics. So coprolalia and coproprasia, only 10% of people who are diagnosed with Tourette syndrome actually have it. That would be your swearing, your middle fingers, any obscene or socially unacceptable and inappropriate words, phrases, or movements that everyone thinks Tourette's is. Like that's the way you see it in media. But only 10% of the diagnosed population actually has it. I do have it myself. And when you're talking about tic families, there's the ending of the word, so lalia or prasia. Lalia would be any words or phrases, any vocal tics, and then prasia would mean any gestures. So you have echolalia, which would be repeating someone else's words or phrases. That happens to me a lot. The other day, I was at CVS doing self-checkout, and it said, please put your items in the bagging area. And then my tics repeated, please put your items in the bagging area. Or if my friends would be talking in the middle of a conversation, my tics would just pick any random word or phrase that they said and repeat it right back to them. And then you have palilalia, which is one's own words. So it's not something that anyone else said. It's just something that the tics decided to say. Now, there are also a bunch of other ones that usually go very unnoticed and they're a little bit more rare, but they are important to note because they are still tics. And that would be the graphia tics. So there are tics where people would draw or write or even type, and they're all tics. So writing an essay, you can have a tic writing a bunch of words, the same word all the way down a line, and that can get very stressful during exams because you obviously don't have time to waste like that. And if you don't have a pen, then you can't like erase and all of those things. So you're also having your writing tics, and all of those can be very stressful, especially in school or the work environment. And tics change. They can range from very mild to very severe. As I said, everyone is completely different. Not everyone has the same exact tics, and they can change over time in frequency, severity, type, and they can be triggered by a lot of emotions, even happy ones. So stress, anxiety, excitement, fatigue, and illness. And tics are not contagious, except to people who have tics. So if you don't have Tourette syndrome or another tic disorder, you won't get tics until you develop a tic disorder. But if I'm having a conversation with another friend who has Tourette syndrome, they can catch the tics that I have. So if I have a tic of saying like, hi, how are you? Their Tourette syndrome can catch on to that tic and then repeat that back to me. And it'll become part of like their little tic reservoir booklet that we all have in our brains that keeps tabs of all of the tics that we've had. So it can be added to theirs. They can have tics and it'll be added to mine. At the conference that I went to train us for this, it was an auditorium filled with 100 kids who had Tourette syndrome, and one person had a tic, and then the entire auditorium caught that tic. And it was just the entire auditorium of 100 kids repeating that same phrase. So now we come to co-occurring conditions. This can be anything that happens together with Tourette syndrome, usually they're mental health disorders or anything else of the sort. You can have ADHD, OCD, behavioral problems, anxiety, depression, mood problems, autism, sleeping problems, rage, also FND, which is functional neurological disorder, which I also have, and that goes hand in hand with my tics. So with the co-occurring conditions, the co-occurring conditions can trigger Tourette's, and then the Tourette's can trigger the co-occurring conditions. So one day, if you're having a flare-up of, let's say, Tourette's, then if you also have ADHD, it can also make things a little bit hard to manage. You can be a little bit more unfocused and other things like that. So as I said, Tourette syndrome is a little different for everyone. I described it as a cough attack, a very severe cough attack, where you try to hold it in and it gets worse. But a little bit more specifically, when you have Tourette syndrome, for me specifically, it's like a ball of energy that builds up in my chest or in my stomach, or sometimes my friends will describe it as like energy shooting like out of their arm if their arm were to go to the side as a tic. And if you try to suppress it, which means like kind of holding it in a little bit and waiting to see if it'll pass, it can happen, but it can also be very straining on the body. So it can cause a lot of physical side effects. So with all that energy buildup, when you have a tic, it kind of explodes like a volcano, and then the tic comes out and usually you feel better. If you try to suppress it, the energy builds and builds and builds and builds. I haven't had anything happen to me, but one of my friends, Tourette syndrome, tried suppressing all of her tics for a day and then she went into a seizure. So it can have a lot of strenuous effects on the body. It can make you super tired if you suppress for a long period of time, or it can become something more severe. So Tourette syndrome in the media is very important to talk about because there are a lot of misconceptions. If you've ever watched South Park or been on TikTok around 2020, 2021, there was a lot of news about Tourette syndrome and all the misconceptions. So South Park is a show and they can do a lot of offensive things, but in the name of comedy, I guess. So there was this one episode where Eric Cartman was in the grocery store and he encountered this one kid with Tourette syndrome. And the way South Park kind of like brought on Tourette's to the public was just all swearing. So all corporalalia. And as we just learned, corporalalia only happens to 10% of the diagnosed population. So that was another massive misconception. And then you learn the stereotype of Tourette syndrome is only swearing or sticking up the middle finger or pushing over people. But obviously that is not the case. And for TikTok, there are people who, yes, have Tourette syndrome and they are very educational. Evie Meg, for example, she is fantastic. She's in the UK and she has Tourette syndrome and she brings a lot of awareness, does a lot of fun educational videos, and then sometimes some like funny challenges like baking with Tourette syndrome and different things like that. And people really learn a lot. But then you also have people pretending to have Tourette syndrome who don't actually have it. And then that adds to the stigma, it adds to the stereotypes. So when you come across Tourette syndrome in media, you just kind of have to be aware and a little bit cautious of, okay, is this actually Tourette syndrome? Are they spreading more stigma, more stereotypes? If chances are, if it's all cursing, it's spreading a stereotype. Even though a lot of my tics are swearing, but there's also a mixture of the hopping and the twirling and the raising my arm for 30 minutes. But yeah, so it is very important to stay aware of those types of things just to help reduce stigma. And that is the end. It was kind of quick. So here are some resources. The Tourette Association of America has a website. It's tourette.org, and the link is there. And then two amazing physicians from the University of Miami. Dr. Jason Marguleski is a neurologist who specializes in tics and movement disorders. And then Dr. Barbara Coffey is a psychiatrist who is actually on the medical advisory board of the Tourette Association of America. And she is a psychiatrist who specializes, and I think has over 40 plus years specializing in Tourette syndrome itself. So they are two fantastic doctors. If you have any concerns or any speculation, there are their office phone numbers. And if you want to know a little bit more about Tourette's, you can always visit the Tourette Association website. And that's the end.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, for this wonderful presentation, for taking your time to educate us about Tourette syndrome. Everything that you shared was so important, but especially you were talking about how different it can look from one person to the next. When we talk about mental health conditions, we know people can experience those signs and symptoms differently from one person to the other. And then you bring it together, which, so perfectly well put, the fact that the media portrays Tourette's and many mental health conditions in a way that it stigmatizes those conditions. You were sharing before how, of course, doing presentations like this, educating our community, but even following other people that, like you, are sharing their own experience, what it looks like for them, sharing resources, how important it is to end the stigma around Tourette or any other mental health condition, which is what we do or as the expert speaker meetings, to make sure that we educate ourselves. You were talking about, people often ask, how do I get diagnosed for Tourette's or another mental health condition? You were sharing that you have to have specific criteria to be able to be diagnosed to have Tourette syndrome. And how would that look like? And it looks different from everyone. And it depends on how your symptoms develop and how your own condition develops. So we're all different, and we know that about mental health conditions. So we really, really appreciate it. I want to now open it up for anyone that has any questions. I know that we had a question in the chat that I want to read to you, Kelsey. This person that joined us was looking forward to know if tics can be cured.
So Tourette syndrome cannot actually be cured yet. There are treatments for it. So that can be depending on your co-occurring conditions, if you even have any. That can look like if you have severe anxiety, they can prescribe you medication for your anxiety in the hopes that it will lessen the tics, because with anxiety, you have a bunch of different things that can be going on, and the nervousness and all of the different symptoms can trigger the Tourette's. So by giving you the anxiety medication, they hope that it'll lessen the tics. And then you also have therapies such as CBIT, which is comprehensive behavioral intervention for tics. I actually went through that at the beginning of my diagnosis. It has about a 75% success rate when I took it. And it's just sitting, I did it through Zoom at the University of Miami. And it's you sitting with therapists, and you jot down a list of all of your tics, and they try to give you what's a competing response. So if I have a neck tic that goes to the side, the competing response would be, okay, try to stiffen your neck muscles when you feel the urge to do the tic. And then hopefully, as you practice the techniques throughout time, it'll lessen the frequency of those tics.
Thank you for answering that question, Kelsey. We really appreciate it. I will invite anyone, if they have any questions, feel free to put your questions in the chat or unmute yourself. But again, Kelsey, I can't stress this enough, how much we appreciate you taking the time to join us, to be able to talk about Tourette syndrome in such a way that we can all understand and learn more as a community, and understand, again, I go back to this point often, that when we're talking about mental health conditions, we're all different, and there are different signs and symptoms. And again, not everything that we see on the media, like you were sharing before, is what reality looks like. We know that sometimes the media likes to portray mental health conditions in a negative way, which of course uh, helps, or it doesn't help when we're trying to destigmatize mental health conditions. So I really love the example that you use and some of the good examples in the media, but also, we do have that option of following people like you, wonderful people that can share their own experience. You share someone else, an influencer in the UK, and she shares her own experience with Tourette syndrome. So I really, really do appreciate it. You are doing our community such a huge favor by being so open and explaining it in such a way that we can all understand. So I want to look at the chat to see if we have more questions. Going through the chat. So I have one more question, Kelsey. So if someone is experienced a tic in front of me, how can I help? What a great question.
Yes, a fantastic question, actually. So tics, obviously, as we talked about, range from mild to severe, and it's different for everyone. So if they're experiencing more mild tics, obviously sit down, ask, how can I help? Because everyone has different needs. Something might be like, get me to a more quiet place, because noise can be a huge trigger for tics. If they're in a very crowded environment, maybe bright lights, very sensory overstimulating experience, that can also be a huge trigger. So just finding like a calm, quiet room if that's what they need. Obviously, just don't pick them up and take them somewhere. Ask them what they need. Sometimes it could be noise canceling headphones, or just to like lay down and take a minute. Maybe it can be water. If they're experiencing more severe tics, what we call a tic attack, and that would be several tics, one after the other, rapid fire. It can be a combination of motor tics and vocal tics at the same time. If they're kicking and flailing, but they're sitting down, maybe step away a little bit so you don't get hurt, and then ask, how can I help? Most of the time, it can be a little stressful in the situation, especially talking through tics, especially in a tic attack. So it'll take them a few minutes to get what they need to say out. So be very patient with that. Don't try to complete the sentences and assume what they need. Just wait for them to get out what they need. And again, it'll probably be less stimulating environment, maybe some noise cancellation headphones, lay down, water, just some things to help calm the nervous system down. So it is a little different from everyone, but the generalized kind of helps are still kind of there.
Thank you so much for that answer. And it's so important, right? To learn how we can help and how we can support someone that has a mental health condition. How can we be there for them? You just mentioned something, don't complete their sentence. So again, it goes back to how do we educate ourselves so we can support our community. We have a couple more other questions on the chat. The next question is, are tics painful, or is suppressing tics painful?
So if you're suppressing one tic and it kind of goes by a little fast, it wouldn't be as painful. It's just uncomfortable in a way. So all that energy builds up, either if it's in your leg or your arm, or for me, like it's in my chest and my stomach for all my tics. Just a little bit, it won't be hurt, like it won't hurt. But if it's persistent tics, like trying to suppress an entire tic attack, then it can become very painful. And then, like I said before, different people have different physical reactions to it. I haven't had any, but then people I know have had seizures and different things like that, trying to suppress all of their tics. So it honestly depends person to person, but usually it doesn't.
Thank you for sharing that. And the questions keep coming, which we are all learning. I'm so excited and so grateful that you're answering those questions for our community. So how can we help parents who are supporting their loved ones if they have Tourette syndrome? How can as parents support our loved ones?
Yeah, so my parents are very supportive, and things that they kind of do is if I'm having a really bad tic day and I had an event to go to, maybe cancel me going to the event if it's going to be a very high stimulus environment, or if it's something that you can't cancel, um, maybe bring support items like sensory toys. I have tangles that are little plastic things that kind of like wind up, and it keeps me busy. It distracts my hands. noise canceling headphones or earplugs are great. One thing that really helps my tics is just distracting myself on my phone. So just kind of be very supportive of their coping mechanisms. Even if you're at a family event, but they're on their phone, maybe don't tell them, hey, get off the phone, just because it could bring about tics and make them really nervous. If that's what's distracting them, or even playing music in one ear, let it be, because the more they use the coping strategies, the less likely tics will be able to show up. And then at some point, they will be able to stop the coping strategy, maybe through the middle of the event, or and then the tics won't happen as often. If you're at home and there's a tic attack, get them to a comfortable place, maybe like a soft couch or a bed. If they're on the floor, maybe a pillow. Um, I like very soft things when I'm having tic attacks, like soft, cozy blankets and pillows, things like that. But everyone's different. Some people don't like anything touching them and they're like, get the blanket away from me. So just kind of hear them out. And if you're going to any events or anything like that, just be very cautious of the environment, because it can be very triggering for tics. Like my tics do not like parties at all, but I have to go to them because they're family events. So we always have to have the coping strategies. One thing for families, if you travel a lot and you're going through the airport, tics love airports, and especially going through TSA. Be very mindful of that, because we have had some close calls with me going through TSA. Um, the tics obviously have no filter, so a bunch of coping strategies through airports and long flights, especially if you're sitting down or you're going outside the country for a very long time. Take like sensory toys, fidget spinners, fidget cubes, just anything that helps the tics to decrease their chances of showing up and turning into a tic attack.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You just mentioned something that is so important, right? Learning what those supportive coping mechanisms are of our loved ones, to make sure that we are ready to support them, and they can look different. You sharing that you like soft things to someone else can be something else, but be very mindful of what those are to be able to support them. There's another question in the chat at the beginning. You shared that you like to ice skate. So the question is, do your tics affect your ability to ice skate?
So for me, not really. I've been skating for about 4 years. And the thing with Tourette's is when you're really focused on something like driving, I drive perfectly fine. Maybe if I'm having a bad tic day, I won't go out and drive. But as you're doing things that you genuinely enjoy, Tourette's kind of take a step back because you're very focused. So when I'm ice skating, I'm very focused. Maybe a tic has interrupted me once or twice in the middle of a spin, but generally it's perfectly fine because I'm doing something that I love. I'm in a very calm environment for me, and my tics just kind of take a step back.
Thank you for sharing. We really appreciate it. Again, the questions keep coming, and this is why we do our Ask the Expert Speaker meeting, because we all have questions and we're learning together. So another question is, how can the school system support and assist a student with tics? Such a great question.
Yes, and I've actually had a lot of experience with that at my high school because I was diagnosed going into my freshman year. Um, So first thing, if parents are coming to you saying, hi, my student has a tic disorder, one of the main things would be to set them up for a 504 or an IEP, whatever applies to that situation. And some of the accommodations might be a little out of context, a little bit bizarre, but whatever the student needs within reason to feel good in that kind of environment. Obviously have the teachers know, and maybe have the student and the parents sit down with the teacher just to let them know what the tics are, because I've been in situations where my teachers got the email, oh yeah, she has Tourette syndrome. I know what that is. But then I have a tic and they're like, what are you doing? So maybe give them warning of what the tics look like specifically. If it's like a middle school or high school, like all of the period teachers, all the subjects, since they are changing from class to class, make sure that all of the teachers are very well situated with the 504 or the IEP and the accommodations. Sometimes accommodations can look like stepping out of class, or I get extended time and a half on all of my exams. in class and then also on my AP exams and my FSAs. So extended time on test is always very helpful because you never know how the ticks are going to be, especially in that kind of pressured environment. Stepping out of class can be very helpful because if there's too many things going around, like a group project and everyone's in groups and they're all talking, taking a minute and stepping out into a quiet hallway can be very, very helpful in reducing tics and different things like that. And then just kind of stick up for the student when they can't stick up for themselves. I would say is very helpful because I have been in situations where kids were bullying me for having Tourette's in front of my face, but I was also in the middle of a tic attack, so I couldn't say anything to them. So my teachers had to step in and be like, hey, don't do that. That's not nice. You literally cannot do that. That is so rude. And then they kind of explain to the students when I'm not able to. So if the student comes forward with any bullying or anything like that, harassment, or just uncooperativity from the teachers, just be very supportive in that if you're an administrator, because sometimes the teachers can be a little iffy with the tics and they might not understand it as much. So it's really nice to have a sit down with them and just explain it to them a little bit better.
Thank you for sharing and for providing us that information. Sometimes it goes back to educating ourselves. Sometimes we don't know what the symptoms are, what the tics are. You were sharing before in your presentation how different they can be, and there are different types. So I think it's so important what you just share, making sure that they have the information so they are better equipped to support the student or their loved one if they have Tourette syndromes. Thank you so much for sharing that. This question kind of goes hand in hand with what you were talking about right now. How does emotional instability have any correlation with Tourette syndrome?
Yeah, and that goes back to the co-occurring conditions. So ADHD, OCD, depression, anxiety, even DID, things like that, they can affect Tourette syndrome, and if Tourette syndrome can affect the symptoms from those co-occurring conditions. So it honestly depends on, in this case, emotional instability, what that would entail. If it's a little bit more anger that they're experiencing, rage is also a co-occurring condition with Tourette syndrome that is very common. So they kind of feed off each other, and it'll be different for every person. The only co-occurring condition I have is functional neurological disorder. So I can't really speak for anyone that has like depression or anxiety or OCD with Tourette syndrome, but I'm sure that there are other people who can speak on that, but it'll just depend on the person. But they do kind of have a correlation.
Thank you, Kelsey, for answering that. And again, it goes back to we all have mental health, but mental health conditions are different depending on the person. And if they have, like you were sharing, another mental health condition, they have different symptoms and it could look different from one person to the next. So we have another question here. I'll read it to you from our chat. What can we at NAMI do to educate employers to be able to help their staff who experience tics? Does the Tourette community have educational materials that we can share with everyone in our community?
Oh, for sure. So, to be able to help employers and educate employers, if you took anything away from the presentation, it would just be make everyone kind of aware, like, hey, like, obviously talk to the person first. Hey, are you comfortable with letting people know that you have Tourette's or tics? What can we do specifically to help you? And then if they're comfortable passing that information along to the other people in their group, whether it's the employer, the manager, anyone else, and just be very mindful that some days may not look so great. Tourette syndrome can make it very hard to do daily tasks, especially on a very bad tic day. I had days where I was at school, but I wasn't able to do any work because my arms were flailing everywhere. I kept on throwing pencils, pens. It was hard for me to type my essays. It was hard for me to work in group projects. So I was at school, but I couldn't really do much. So it is very important to take that into consideration, that it might take a little bit longer, especially if their tics are very severe, for them to get things done. And it can just be very mindful of that and just be very patient, especially if they're in a meeting or like me giving a presentation. I'm lucky that my tics weren't too bad today. But if they're giving a presentation or speaking in a meeting and they're having a ton of tics, again, just be patient. And then educating the other staff members or the other employers You can educate them on what Tourette syndrome is, that it's completely involuntary. It is a neurodevelopmental disability, and it is covered by ADA. So yeah, and if you want any other resources, the Tourette Association of America has their website, which is tourette.org, which I actually am screen sharing right now. They have a bunch of resources on there, and if you want to get in contact with someone, they have a phone number and an email. And then also their Instagram, they have a lot of webinars just like this, and they actually do have some for companies and employers of what to do with staff with Tourette syndrome a little bit more specifically.
This is great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And for, you're a youth ambassador for the Tourette Association of America. And I know this is what you do. You help our community by educating us about Tourette syndrome. And we can't thank you enough for being so open about it and sharing your experience with us and sharing it in a way that everything that you're sharing, we can take into our communities and make sure that we tell someone else, that we share with someone else. So there's one more comment that I wanted to read to you in the chat. It's not a question, but they just wanted to say thank you to you for being so brave and have such a positive role model for young adults. And we echo that message. We can thank you enough for taking the time, joining us tonight, doing this presentation, answering all those questions, sharing your own experience, and walking us through what that experience is like, but also answering specific questions, great questions for our community. Our chat we keep getting messages, Kelsey. So another message, you're an inspiration and a magnificent young woman. Again, we echo that message too. And we really, really appreciate that you took the time to answer our questions, to be here, to provide information for NAMI Miami-Dade so we can educate our community. As I shared before and at the beginning, we record this as the expert speaker meeting, and we'll share this in social media, on our newsletter, on our website, on our YouTube channel. So we'll be sharing all this wonderful information and presentation to everyone in our community. And of course, we'll also share this information with community organizations and partners so they can request a presentation into their organizations and learn more about Tourette syndrome. Also in the chat, as I mentioned at the beginning, we share a couple of things that are coming up for NAMI Miami-Dade. Of course, our helpline, the information is in the chat. Any questions that anyone has about NAMI Miami-Dade, our support groups, educational programs. If you need information to reach out, Kelsey or the Tourette.org organization, please feel free to reach out through our helpline Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. The number is 305-665-2540. Again, Kelsey, thank you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you, everyone that has joined us tonight. We have over 18 people, and then many others will get to see it when we send this recording out. What you're doing is amazing. You are an amazing person. Thank you so much for taking the time and educating our community. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great evening. Thank you for joining us. Please reach out. And thank you, Kelsey. Have a great night. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.